Okay, good morning, everyone. This is the select group who could make it in the rain and relative cold. The rest will be watching from their comfortable places on the YouTube version of the video. So we'll do this one for them. So today we're going to talk about Black conservatives, and it's really interesting. I sort of begin by giving you some portraits of some Black conservatives. On the left is Booker T. Washington. On the right is former Secretary of State and Stanford Provost Condoleezza Rice. Beneath that is affirmative action foe Ward Connerly. And bottom left is talk show host Armstrong Williams. These are very different guises of Black conservatism. They all, in some ways, have different issues. We can talk about some of their issue debates and different concerns. But Black conservatism has a long history. That history, in some sort of organized basis, goes back to Booker T. Washington, who you read in his Atlanta exposition address, and represents a stream of Black thought which organizationally is probably the weakest, but has always had a kind of place in the American consciousness, and has also always had a ability to grasp extraordinarily superior resources or access to the public sphere in many senses. So why the controversy? There's some very unflattering images of Black conservatives. There's the one on the top left portraying Justice Clarence Thomas as a lawn jockey. Uncle Thomas, it reads lawn jockey for the far right. There's one of Condoleezza Rice saying, "I'm fighting for Whitey. Allow me to take charge on the front lines." There's a portrayal of Ward Connerly as a puppet or marionette. And finally, Haiti Colin Powell's Crime in Progress. So Black conservatives have frequently, if not always, drawn a great deal of controversy. And we'll talk about what that's all about, and it's frequently been because they've been perceived in many ways to hold ideas that are anathema or against the broader interest of the African American community. And frequently, though there is a legitimate philosophical basis for Black conservatives, they're perceived to hold these ideas much more in sort of contrast to the notions of linked fate. They're held to hold these ideas generally for kind of personal gain, rather than necessarily the sort of view of the entire community. So what are the core beliefs of Black conservatives? One of the first core beliefs is generally a more amenable, I have that on there twice, so I'll say it twice, a more amenable view of free markets. That is, so Black conservatives range from generally adopt a very sort of libertarian approach to the marketplace. Government should only intervene or intervene in a very limited fashion in the marketplace. More controversially, there's a range of different people who believe in the markets, though. As I said, conservatives frequently believe in, Black conservatives take the sort of libertarian view about the intervention in the marketplace and from liberalism. More controversial is a belief in kind of accommodation. That is, frequently Black conservatives see opposition to white racism as placing Blacks outside of the American mainstream. Blacks should seek to sort of fit in, to assimilate, to not, in particular, sort of challenge whites in a range of different ways. And I've already said free markets. Frequently, black conservatives are also sort of race men. So it isn't just that they see themselves as adopting these ideas simply as Americans. They see these ideas as essential for racial uplift, racial improvement, for blacks achieving the kinds of gains that they need to. So they aren't just thinking of themselves. They frequently use their black identity in ways as both sort of rhetorical positioning, but also as a means of, and they are concerned. They believe that these are the ideas that are most useful for the black community. In connection with their belief in free markets, they're generally against government intervention or programs. In fact, some of them would argue that programs like affirmative action, welfare are not only not effective, but are actually harmful to the black community because they create what they perceive to be dependency and a lack of sort of, pull yourself up by your bootstraps ethos. And they would argue that the problems that the black community has is a sort of unwillingness to engage in forms of self-help. In fact, the other part about it is that they so believe that blacks need to engage in self-help. One of the things that they argue is that racism is not the central problem facing the black community. That the problems facing the black community are generally internal to the black community. That it is, and that in fact, the focus on racism, and as black conservatives would call it, victimhood, is what perpetuates lack of black achievement. I quoted Condoleezza Rice at the bottom of this, but I'm kind of feeling like it's a little unfair. She had once said, speaking about the Jim Crow South in Alabama, that things were a little off kilter. And that was widely decried as a kind of comment that sort of minimized the problem of racism. Later on, Condoleezza Rice herself supported affirmative action, but also more controversially during the last election campaign, made the comment that America was born with a birth defect of slavery and racism that was actually attacked by Lou Dobbs, who referred to her as a cotton-picking politician. In a sort of moment of, well, he actually didn't quite say it. He said cotton pick, and he stopped himself. But in that sense, she had crossed the line in terms of stating what is the obvious, that racism had been a central and deep problem in American history. She actually made those comments at the height of the Jeremiah Wright controversy in the last campaign, which was kind of very interesting for her to kind of just to say that in and around, and in particular in and around now President Obama, then candidate Obama's speech on race. Finally, when it comes to one of the main things that sort of distinguishes black conservatives are their views on gender and sexuality, or at least their emphasis on questions on gender norms and sexuality, which are actually strikingly similar to black nationalism. There's a kind of sense of puritanical respectability. So one of the things that they see as essential problems in black communities is out-of-wedlock births. They generally will often take very conservative positions on questions like abortion, and see in particular the sort of free exercise of sexuality by black women, young black women, as a kind of central problem to the black community. So in some ways they want to restore what they perceive as traditional family values, and that is the best way to recover some sense of the community ethos. So in this sense, right, single parent households, all of these things become the problem in the black community. In fact, sometimes to the exclusion of discussions of racism, or that they say that these are much bigger than racism itself, right? The route to overcoming racism, if there is to, not have children out of wedlock, work hard, do a range of different things. So why do we hear so much from Black conservatives? So the Atlanta Exposition Address that you read was a kind of announcement by Washington of a way to go, right? And in that address, Washington makes a series of arguments. One, he takes challenging separate segregation off the table, right? Washington says we can be as separate as the fingers on a hand. He then makes another move in the speech, which is to suggest that perhaps white immigrants in the early 20th century might be bringing communist socialist ideas to America, and that whites were familiar with their hardworking blacks who had not long ago been their slaves. In fact, Washington himself had been a slave and wrote about it in his autobiography, Up from Slavery. So Washington makes that argument that we should be the preferred labor source. And then he says, look, we need to aim at, fitting into a niche in the economy, which is the growing industrial sector. And that if blacks can perform well economically in the country and do their job and not sort of challenge for civil rights or make whites uncomfortable, that eventually they would be incorporated into the nation because of their general usefulness. There's a little bit of a problem with that logic in that, blacks were useful during slavery, right? They were quite useful, but not treated equally necessarily. And so he saw, in many ways, Washington saw the idea of, so he basically capitulates or accommodates the idea of segregation. We're not going to challenge segregation. We're willing to accept segregation as a kind of basis. Just give us the kind of resources we need and fit us into our niche in the economy, and we'll do our own thing. And that's, if you note, one of the things that's really interesting is that when Marcus Garvey came to the United States, Garvey comes to work with Washington. He doesn't necessarily come to work with Du Bois, but by the time he arrives in the United States, Washington's already passed away. And he's not available to him. So in many ways, some of the ethos of at least some versions of Black nationalism emerge out of the ethos of Black conservatism. It's just you add the strong race pride element rather than the idea that America is just fine. We need to figure out how to work within it. In that sense, Washington said a lot of things that, in particular, wealthy and powerful whites wanted to hear. We're not going to challenge racism. We're not going to challenge segregation. We're not going to do things that make you feel politically uncomfortable, and we're going to make you a lot of money. So he was able to garner support from, he was invited to lunch by the president. He was given large sums of money by benefactors like Carnegie to build the Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama. And was part of a movement along with Du Bois, who was a little different, to develop a series of historically Black colleges and universities. You can contrast the model of Fisk and others that were sort of associated with, and Clark that were associated with Du Bois, with the Tuskegee model. Tuskegee focused on engineering and industrial education, agricultural education, while Fisk and others focused on what Du Bois had mastered himself, a sort of liberal education that focused on the liberal arts and sciences, mastering the sort of general intellectual aspects, general intellectual growth and theories of the world. So in Washington's mind, there isn't much, blacks shouldn't really be focusing on poetry and music and the humanities, social sciences, things like that. You need to learn practical things, engineering, agriculture. And Tuskegee focused on that. It focused on that so well, it generated things like the Tuskegee Airmen who flew missions. We saw them at the inauguration, who flew missions during World War II. That was part of the engineering education, was that people were prepared to take those kinds of roles. Black conservatism has never had a mass organization. So there's never been a kind of broad-based organization of black conservatives ready to go out there and do their business wherever it may be. It's generally been small groups or a conglomeration of well-funded individuals operating on their own. And black conservatives have frequently been the darlings of media and other white elites, and have had a kind of disproportionate impact. One need only turn on sort of CNN or MSNBC. Who are the black conservatives on CNN? It's Amy Holmes, right, from the Independent Women's Forum, and so generally, oftentimes when black voices are on in mainstream media, they're sort of balanced, sort of 50-50 between black liberals, you know, sort of broadly defined, and black conservatives. When black conservatives, if you read your Dawson book and using public opinion research, are the sort of least popular, is the least popular trend in African American political thought. So less than sort of 15, you know, less than about probably 5 to 10% of the black population would in any sense, probably less than 5, would in any sense consider themselves to be strong black conservatives in any real way. Yet they represent about sort of 50% of what you're going to see on the media. I call this sort of media novelty acts, right? So you have, you know, black conservatives. You even get people like Camille Paglia, right? Sort of anti-feminist lesbians. These are the kinds of things, the kind of dog bites man. I mean, man bites dog. Everybody knows dog bites man is always a good story. But when man bites dog, it's a kind of interesting story. And in fact, if we were to think about it, right, we would see more black nationalists in the public sphere than we would black conservatives, right? If we were thinking about, if we wanted to construct sort of alternative debates that mapped onto real discussions in the African American community, or for that matter, black feminists and others, but these perspectives are not as prevalent in the public sphere. And in fact, in some ways, it's quite interesting that certain black conservatives generally always try and sort of challenge and sort of say that they're marginal, oh, we're not given a voice, et cetera. So Armstrong Williams has a radio show every single day. Who comes on? Larry Elder comes on in LA, right, sort of all day long. He's a libertarian. So they have a sort of disproportionate impact on the media, right? You don't have no one gets up every day to the Louis Farrakhan show, right? Or and which is probably a much more dominant point of view in black thought. Or there's no Angela Davis show on a regular basis, which, you know, espouses sort of feminist and Marxist points of view from a black perspective. So what is black about black conservatism? There's always the question of authenticity with black conservatives, right? Since their views are so marginal relative to others, Washington was powerful mostly because of his ability to sort of control and marshal resources. He had the Tuskegee machine had a huge amount of resources in areas all over the country. And in some senses, Washington did things like, for instance, you know, operated newspapers, was able to fire journalists, black journalists who didn't toe the kind of Tuskegee machine line. And so he was able to use those resources to reward and punish and sort of bring people into line, though the general trend in the black community was sort of against his ideas. But so black conservatives have always, as demonstrated in the sort of representations, the use of the terms Uncle Tom, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, have their authenticity questioned. And they're all different versions. I don't want to say that there's a single cast of sort of white conservatives. There's, of course, kind of liberal conservatives who, sort of think, oh, well, the free market is less, is less that central, is more central than intervention. We need to do something about racism, but it's not the sort of main thing. We need to do what we can for ourselves. And they're trying to sort of accommodate capitalism. There's a much more libertarian, and then there's also the kind of neoconservative strain, which is sort of frequently matched with the strong kind of religious conservatism of the kind, where the central issues are, gay marriage, abortion, et cetera. One thing is that though black conservatives have frequently been questioned amongst African Americans, reading the Clarence Thomas essay that you read, No Room in the Inn, at the end, they've also had their authenticity questioned in right-wing circles, right? Could they really, being a black person, could you really ever prove that you're conservative enough for the white people to believe you, right? And this goes all the way back to the sort of, at least some fears by whites, but also in many cases the poems by folks like Paul Laurence Dunbar. So We Wear the Mask That Grins and Bears. And it's about the idea that being a black person meant that sometimes you would pretend that you were getting along with whites when you really quite were not. In many cases, in the black church, while it's been, of course, arguably figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Jesse Jackson, people forget that Al Sharpton is a evangelical minister, right? When people say, well, Christian evangelicals think this, they forget that the range of Christian evangelicals includes these figures that are sort of unproblematically on the left. But at the same time, there's been a sort of movement amongst some black ministers through a adjustment of different kinds of ideology, which has moved them somewhat closer over time to black conservatives. One particular trend is represented by folks like T.D. Jakes. Jakes and others, and ministers like Eddie Long in Atlanta and others, have a particular sort of version of gospel called prosperity gospel, right? So it's about lifting yourself by your bootstraps, making your own choices in the economic marketplace. But then T.D. Jakes also has, is not sort of open and affirming of gays and lesbians, writes, what is that book he wrote, Woman Thou Art Loosed? And his recent film, what's the movie that T.D. Jakes has out? What's it called? Not Easily Broken, right? And the film, sort of the ethos that T.D. Jakes has in both of these sort of books is there's a sort of breakdown in the black family and black community life, and whose fault is it? It's really black women, right? It's that black women are not understanding their role, they're not focused on staying home and having children and kind of traditional roles, and this is causing problems in the black community. So you put that on top of a kind of prosperity preaching, anti-gay stuff, and you get very close to a very consistent line that is extraordinarily conservative, but it's also seductive in a way in which, because African Americans, there are a lot of single moms, people are concerned about single motherhood is also associated with poverty, not because there's something wrong with single moms, but because black women get paid so much less than everybody else in the marketplace. And so some of that can be very attractive to people to think about solving their own problems. So solving my own problem is through getting married. And then you want to protect traditional marriage from what are perceived to be a set of attacks. And while we're going to do black feminism next week, one of the sort of principal antagonists of black conservatives, as well as black nationalists, is often black feminists. In particular because you can describe exactly what sort of T.D. Jakes is arguing, which is, this kind of reaffirmation of a kind of traditional family, but also these kinds of essays. In particular, I'm thinking of an essay written by by essayist Stanley Crouch entitled Aunt Jemima Doesn't Like Uncle Ben. Yeah, it is kind of funny. And in that, I actually wanted you guys to read that essay, but I couldn't find my copy of it to put in the reader. But what Crouch does in that essay is he argues that the new darling of the white left are black feminists who want to show the sort of pathologies of black men. And so that's hence the essay is Aunt Jemima Doesn't Like Uncle Ben. And so one particular consistent line amongst black conservatives is that the black community is largely being manipulated by white liberals who are kind of selling them a bit of goods, dependency on welfare, dependency on affirmative action, a turn away from the traditional family, et cetera, things that are detrimental for the development and growth of the black family. And these are also lines that are very similar to lines developed by various versions of cultural nationalism, and then for a while in particular groups like the Nation of Islam. So, but one of the antagonisms related to black conservatives and black feminists is the controversy over Clarence Thomas, his appointment to the Supreme Court, where he was accused of sexual harassment by his former employee and lawyer Anita Hill, and the hearings. I'm actually going to show you guys. We're gonna go to that later, where Clarence Thomas suggested that bringing up the sort of questions about his potential sexual harassment was equivalent to a high-tech lynching, and I will show you that. And it was sort of interesting because Thomas is one who, in most sort of aspects of his life, is sort of, in particular in his jurisprudence, has sort of downplayed racism or downplayed any sense to remedy racism. But at that moment, he relied on the most violent image of racism in the context of the U.S. and used it against, right? Lynching was normally white men attacking black men for some supposed indiscretion with a white woman. This time it was a black man for some supposed indiscretion with a black woman. Black conservatism and class, a good portion of black conservatives are middle and wealthy, though middle class and wealthy, though the overwhelming number of blacks that are middle class and wealthy are not black conservatives. Don't get me wrong here. There are religious conservatives, so there are people who come to their black conservatism through issues who are kind of one-issue conservatives. So whether it's abortion or gay marriage, they sort of see themselves attracted to certain aspects of conservatism. So many of these people are also part of labor unions, so they have a kind of mix of things, right? So they see themselves in terms of their class, but they can't. And like I said, lots come through gender and sexuality, through the abortion issue. And so there's always a kind of clash between cultural issues versus cultural, which is the kind of conservatism of the Christian right, versus a kind of economic conservatism. Cultural conservatism does gain ground in African-American communities around questions of abortion, gay marriage, et cetera. And that, I'm saying, gains ground. We can talk about the Prop 8 stuff later. Not to say that's the overwhelming dominant perspective of gender and sexuality issues, but economic conservatism does not gain that much ground. The African-American community largely prefers various kinds of interventions in the economy, including things like universal health care, et cetera, that quote-unquote true black conservatives would see anathema. So what is the road to uplift? The road to uplift is free markets, that getting away from the evil state. African Americans need to refocus their attentions that racism is not the real problem, They need to focus on individual responsibility, moral leadership, and some would even to say, to the extent that there is racism ongoing, blacks are the perpetrators of it. This is a kind of extreme version by folks like political scientist Carol Swain and radio talk show host Larry Elder. That is, and even to some degree, Ward Connerly, right? And sort of the perpetuation of the existence of black identities and challenging racism becomes the sort of general road or thoughts. One of the things is that there's a number of, I'll go back to that slide. There are a number of black conservatives that have had a lot to say. For instance, black conservative Shelby Steele has frequently talked about how African Americans have failed relative to black immigrants. It shows that it's not a problem of racism, it's about their own individual abilities. That being said, black immigrants don't do as well relative to white immigrants, and immigrants select for a series of positive things. But also, in some ways, there's this strange sort of conflict with black conservatives about, on one hand, trying to say race and racism isn't the central problem, or on the other hand, being entirely preoccupied by it. I can give you one example, which is Shelby Steele's wonderfully prophetic book. He's a Hoover Institute conservative up at Stanford, entitled Bound Man, Why Obama Can't Win. Well, we saw what happened in the real case. But sort of in the book, right, the Shelby Steele draws, he sort of says there's kind of two kinds of black people, both in terms of how they present themselves to themselves and both in the sort of white imagination. And he says there's two kinds of black people. One are bargainers and the others are challengers, right? And so bargainers are people who are willing to give whites the benefit of the doubt, who don't lead with saying, oh, you guys are all racist, and who try to sort of, demonstrate black humanity and a kind of sense of advancement. Challengers are people who, and bargainers make whites feel good about themselves. So he cites, Oprah Winfrey, Tiger Woods. He says, Barack Obama is a kind of bargainer. And he says the other kind are challengers, right? People who confront whites about racism all the time, and in his mind, see all whites as inherently racist, deeply so. And in his mind, he sees sort of, Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton are his sort of prototypical challengers. And so if you're a black person, you're either one of the two, or you're either perceived to be one of the two. And he goes, if you're perceived to be a bargainer, black people won't like you, and if you're a challenger, white people won't like you. So Barack Obama can't win because he has to negotiate this space between being a bargainer and a challenger. And that thus he's a bound man. He's bound by the sort of racial bind, and that we've never freed black people to be outside of either being bargainers or challengers. And so therefore he's gonna have to choose which one. And if he chooses being a bargainer, black people won't vote for him. If he chooses to be a challenger, then whites won't vote for him. And at the same time, right, he sort of loops back around and says, black people are kind of jealous of the success and the sort of articulate, so he won't be perceived as authentic, having gone to Harvard. It was sort of interesting, actually. There was actually black conservatives that were the ones who were most trumpeting the line in the sort of public sphere that early on in the campaigns, that Barack Obama was not black enough, that he did not have a real black experience. In fact, the writers who came out with that were all sort of universally on the right. This was not sort of a sort of drumbeat from the far left or from black nationalists. It was largely from the right, and it's about their kind of preoccupation in some senses with some version of racial authenticity that works somewhat like this, right? If black people are so committed to focusing on racism and are so committed to a version, in their minds, a version of black authenticity that is counterproductive, that elevates ghetto behavior, that seeds itself, then black people can't find any attachment to a figure like Barack Obama, right? If black culture is that broken, then they actually won't like him because black people will reject an African American who was the president of the Harvard Law Review, right? Because he's not real black, right? He doesn't engage in the series. They're going to reject an African American man who, fathers his own children, who lives a kind of traditional lifestyle. So in that sense, right, the black conservative argument is that black culture is so broken that it's impossible for the broader black community to identify with a figure like now President Barack Obama, that where the black community is entirely focused on rappers and sort of pathological behavior, to the point that, and that's sort of the kind of ethos of in the articles that came out from folks on the right, that Barack Obama was not black enough. And in fact, what that was coming out of was that both in his sort of personal life and presentation, right, now President Obama actually symbolized a lot of what black conservatives would like African Americans to present themselves. He's well-spoken. He is married to the mother of his two children, is at least, seemingly on the surface an active and engaged father, though of course we all know that he has to be away very frequently. They don't like some of the liberal policies, but many of them, including Armstrong Williams, obviously Colin Powell ended up endorsing him, and Colin Powell's never been in this sort of extreme thing, but many of them ended up sort of voting for, but Armstrong Williams admitted that he voted for Barack Obama after having been a sort of paragon of the right. And it's in fact because this sort of focus on personal behavior made them say, well, we may not like his politics per se, but he exemplifies the kind of personal behavior that we see as exemplary of how we would see black men behave in the public sphere and advance the black community. So conservatives were a little mixed. So initially they wanted to say that sort of sense of self-representation would be impossible for the broad swaths of the black community who identify with certainly black poor people and definitely black young people, right, who are too enamored with sort of rappers and criminal athletes like Pac-Man Jones, et cetera. I shouldn't jump on Pac-Man, but as an example, right, to identify with this person. And so in some senses, the way they see the way they saw the black community and its pathology is that the black community can no longer recognize, reward, or be attracted to excellence in any sense. It can't. It's too sort of caught in its own pathology of thinking about racism to embrace excellence or to embrace progress in any sense. So for Steele, Obama could never win because he was going to run head on into this. So in some senses, that's the kind of ethos of at least some black conservatives, while others began to see in Obama a kind of some concern about, obviously they didn't always agree with some of his politics, but his self-presentation, his thoughtfulness, his intelligence was something that obviously attracted them. Condoleezza Rice broke into tears the day after November 5th when talking about his election. Colin Powell came out and made an endorsement. In fact, some decrying some of what he perceived to be some of the racist dialogue in the campaign. And actually, even Clarence Thomas sort of argued that the Supreme Court needed to get together, I guess, to watch something election night. I mean, his sort of symbolism was not lost on some black conservatives, though from the beginning, many of them tried to talk about this. So in some ways, right, the election has, though one black conservative, Ward Connerly, whose central issue has been affirmative action, sort of saw the election as sort of vindication, right? This is, for me, this is we no longer need affirmative action anymore. Race doesn't matter. It's not the sort of central issue. These are the range of the guises and perspectives. So even black conservatives are not monolithic on one thing, though there's been a significant amount of time when in particular black conservatives have seen the issues of, in particular, sort of gender, welfare, and affirmative action as kind of central problems. And I'm going to show you guys a video about sort of Clarence Thomas that really illustrates his internal struggles with the sort of question and issues around affirmative action and how he feels it's sort of, black conservatives often feel that they're sort of psychologically diminished by programs like affirmative action, et cetera. Here's Justice Thomas. Any questions about what you've seen so far? About Thomas's autobiography, his beliefs, his concern? Yeah. Yes, he is. He is the black conservative. Any other questions? He, so you can see his sort of logic, right? So it's not, he doesn't see himself as against black people, right? He sees this as him sort of preaching something that the rest of black people don't get, that they need to understand, that they're too caught up. Yeah. Well, he's actually responding to Clarence Thomas's autobiography, in which, in many ways, Clarence Thomas, I mean, there is a kind of contradiction with black conservatives that, on one hand, right, he sort of presents this line of, you know, I want race to be sort of incidental to my kind of existence, and on the other hand, he's kind of justifying what he's saying because he's black and his own personal story and where his grandfather came from, and sort of saying, you know, sort of suggesting that he has more credibility to say these things because he's black. And so there's a kind of, and a lot of what he writes about in his autobiography that the interview is based on is that, you know, I put my Yale degree in a 15-cent frame and left the 15-cent sticker on it because I felt like I was, so in some ways there's a kind of weird back and forth, and this is also what I was sort of pointing to about Shelby Steele and to some degree other black conservatives, which is on one hand, there's a kind of wanting to distance themselves from race, but on the other hand, there's a way of thinking about race that's extraordinarily, you know, so in Clarence Thomas's mind, either his degree is illegitimate by affirmative action or it isn't. And there's no way to sort of think about that the way people might view him is sort of complicated and doesn't necessarily reflect on his own either affirmative action, his own accomplishments. There's a kind of way of thinking about race, right? So Shelby Steele, they're bargainers and they're challengers, and those are the only two things you can be. And obviously there are people who, you know, are willing to sort of say, you know, most white people might not be racist and are not racist, and I welcome their perspectives, but then also that racism is a problem, right? I mean, if you go back to sort of Barack Obama's speech on race, he actually sort of presents this kind of complex view about, and also the sort of nature of kind of, in some ways, racial misunderstanding, and the sort of fuel of sort of racial resentment, right? It's sort of discussed in a kind of open and kind of thoughtful way, in ways that don't sort of divide so naturally. So it's a kind of interesting world to think about that someone like Clarence Thomas inhabits, because I think you're pointing to a kind of uncomfortability. Like on one hand, he wants to say that my race is sort of incidental. On the other hand, he does want to talk about race, and even the interviewer sort of running up against that. And it makes the whole thing very uncomfortable because it's sort of like,
Yeah, I found it kind of ironic that when he was asked about his race, and he was like, "Well, I happen, I'm a man first, and then I happen to be black." And then after that, talking about his experiences in Yale, how it was, like, people treated him differently because he was black. And like you said, it's kind of like an oxymoron. He's trying to play both sides.
it's not really both sides. It's just the way he thinks about it. So he doesn't like being thought of as black, but at the same time, he sees his blackness and the policies associated with it as a stigma that he wants to get rid of, rather than something that he necessarily embraces. Yeah.
I mean, it is this difficult thing going on with the idea of racial authenticity, because I think maybe what he's trying to do is, now that he's been vilified presently as like a traitor of the black race, what he's trying to do in terms of recounting his history is to establish himself in this type of black historical narrative that people will accept as racially authentic in terms of the way that he was raised, and the experiences he's had, and his grandfather places him squarely within an historical narrative that's authentic presently. But then what he's trying to do presently in terms of his own identity is he's trying to challenge the normative black identity, this normative idea of black authenticity. I think he's trying to challenge that authenticity, so that's been structured by liberals. And I think that's what he's trying to do.
Yeah, I think you raise a great point about the sort of move of sort of grounding himself in the South and the sort of rural experience. His grandfather having been associated with the NAACP and teaching him, and frequently, one of the things I find sort of curious or sort of strange about some of the things that black conservatives say, which is the kind of things that his grandfather taught him are the kinds of things that black parents always say to black children. About what you need to do to be successful, what you need to do to get ahead, the values of hard work. Like no one goes to their kid and says, "Hey, don't work hard, don't try and do anything for yourself. Someone will come along and take care of you." Like it's just not generally. And in fact, what most successful black parents are told as children is that because you're African American, you're gonna have to work twice as hard. That the mountain you climb is that much more difficult, and that you have some responsibility to try and remove those barriers, but simultaneously you shouldn't accept the sort of thing. So it's a very interesting thing, but I think you're completely right in that the sort of story of rural poverty is an attempt to sort of, just like Booker T. Washington, it's a version of Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery. Right? Booker T. Washington starts with, I was born a slave. And so the perspective that he presents is supposed to be sort of legitimized by his kind of authentic black experience, by his experience of slavery. Thomas in this documentary is doing the same thing. So they're casting Thomas back into the old South of rural poverty, right? That maybe can't even be understood by the sort of northern liberal generation that's so critical of Thomas and where he comes from. And so there's a kind of way in which they're sort of playing with, I think, the question of authenticity and trying to recapture it in some ways, and recast it as being generative of his experience. Yeah. Well, some do. I mean, some do think racism doesn't exist, or they see, or as I sort of pointed out earlier, I don't think you were here, they see racism as a product of the policies to alleviate racism. So racism would have disappeared but for affirmative action. So Clarence Thomas's argument is that the only racism that exists is the racism that's created by affirmative action. That means that his white counterparts think less of him because he might have been admitted to Yale via affirmative action. So it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So it's so the degree that racism exists because of emphasis on black identity, because of emphasis on because of things like affirmative action, right? It continually brands or stigmatizes black people, and this is the same thing. This is the same thing, kind of thing that Ward Connerly says. You know, the fact of affirmative action stigmatizes black people. So you know, UCLA no longer has affirmative action. You know, so the argument would be that any black student that graduates from UCLA should have no stigma or perception that because they're black they're not as good as anyone else, and I doubt that that's the case, right? So people aren't like, oh, okay, that's an institution without Harvard still has and Yale still have affirmative action. UCLA doesn't. I would prefer to have the student from UCLA because I know that they're just as good as anybody else. You know, it's a kind of that's at least the sort of mentality, or at least, you know, probably to be more charitable, they would argue that the existence of affirmative action anywhere always stigmatizes the entire black community. To wrap up, any questions about what you saw in terms of Thomas at that moment? Yeah.
No, I just want to know, what was the outcome?
Oh, he was confirmed that he's on the Supreme Court. But there were other outcomes, which is that year in response to the Senate, a series of chain of events happened in response to that, including the largest number of women getting elected to the Senate ever in history. That the year following that hearing was "quote unquote" the year of the woman, and in fact, even more importantly, Carol Moseley Braun was elected the first black woman senator and first black senator from Illinois, which was a chain of events that then set in motion the election of later Senator Barack Obama to that same seat. So in some senses, the Clarence Thomas hearings, and it sparked a kind of, in fact, Carol Moseley Braun defeated Senator Alan Dixon in the primary as a result of women being angry with how Anita Hill was treated by the Senate, in particular Democrats in the Senate, and confirming Thomas in response to the allegations that Hill had made. Thomas was appointed to fulfill the seat that had been held by Thurgood Marshall, who was a member of the NAACP, the first black justice. Marshall had retired, soon passed away shortly thereafter. So the kind of specter of race was always kind of around, as well as in many senses, you know, and in fact some, I should try and find it, but there's a really good In Living Color sketch about Clarence Thomas, and let's see if it's on here anywhere. That's not what I wanted to do. One of the sketch, actually, many blacks supported Thomas with the idea that Thomas was going to become his real self once he was on the Supreme Court. That he was just saying those things, right? Going back to Paul Laurence Dunbar, he was just saying those things to get the Supreme Court seat, and then he was gonna, once he was there, he was gonna turn into a kind of black radical. So well, they don't have it up on YouTube. So the sketch goes like this, and I'll end on this. The sketch goes like this. Clarence Thomas is sort of, shuffling around the Supreme Court cloakroom offering to serve the other justices tea and coffee and, yes, sir, and yes, sir, boss, and I'll help you out and all this kind of thing. And then they finally turn to him and say, Clarence, you're one of us. You don't have to do this anymore. And then he kind of throws down the tea server and then starts, saying a bunch of black radical stuff and saying, oh, okay, now I can be who I really am. Well, it turned out, obviously, Clarence Thomas is a kind of true believer in black conservatism, and it really raised, in sort of a profound sense, right? Some people in the black community had really bought into the one wears the mask kind of idea, and had supported Clarence Thomas even through the Anita Hill hearings, suggesting that we needed to have a black person on the Supreme Court. And so one of the things that the whole Thomas episode really emphasized was, re-emphasized, was the ideological differences in the black community. As you can see, Clarence Thomas, but still articulating his perspective from the perspective of being an African American. Okay, I'll see you guys on Thursday.